Don't you dare touch me!
You were mine. Before birth.
The tide had already begun its retreat, dragging cold ribbons of foam back over Wren Calloway's bare feet, when Soren Ansgar reached toward the collar of her coat. Torchlight jumped along the old ritual stones behind him, throwing his shadow twice his size across the wet sand. His fingers hovered a hand's width from the crescent mark beneath her collarbone. The mark every firstborn Calloway daughter carried, the one that would tell the watching assembly whether she was truly the heir the pact was owed. She felt her whole body go still, the particular stillness of a woman deciding, in the space of one breath, exactly how much of herself she intended to keep. "Don't you dare touch me," Wren whispered. Something moved behind his gray eyes, not anger, but recognition, old and immediate, like a bell struck somewhere under the water. His hand did not fall. It stopped, trembling faintly with the effort of stopping, close enough that she felt the heat of it against her skin. "You were mine," he said, and his voice came out low and rough, a growl worn thin over the words. Before birth. It would take her 3 weeks to understand which parts of that sentence were true, and which parts he had simply never been taught to question. Chapter 1. 3 weeks before any of it had a name, Wren's mornings still belonged entirely to canvas and thread. The sail loft sat at the harbor's northern curve, close enough to the water that the walls smelled permanently of salt and tar, and Wren had spent the better part of her 24 years learning every sound it made, which creak meant weather coming, which meant only the wind arguing with itself. She knelt now on the workshop floor with a spread of gray canvas across her lap, working a torn seam back together in stitches so small, and even that Myron Solvig, watching from the doorway, said they looked machine-made. "They're not," Wren said, without looking up. "Machines don't know when a sail's been patched twice already and needs the stitches spread wider so it doesn't tear along the old line." Myron laughed, then sobered, twisting her hands the way she always did before admitting she was short on coin. She was 3 silver pieces light for her husband's mended jib, the only sail she owned outright now that he was gone, and she could not meet Wren's eyes while she said so. Wren did the arithmetic she always did in these moments. What the loft could absorb, what her father would say, what it would cost Marin's pride to be forgiven outright. "Consider the rest paid," she said. "If you'll keep an eye on Cade next week while the fleet's out. He gets into less trouble when someone's actually watching him do it." Myron's shoulders loosened with a relief too large for the small kindness that caused it, and she left with her jib rolled under one arm, walking straighter than she had walked in. Across the room, Tobin Calloway reached for a coil of rigging rope and dropped it. The awl went with it, clattering against the bench. Duh. Wren didn't look up right away. He'd been dropping things for 2 weeks, and they had both been pretending it was nothing. "Cold fingers," he said, flexing his hand the way a man flexes something he no longer fully trusts. "Getting old, that's all it is." She had seen that motion before, a long time ago, in an old fisherman named Harlan who had died of the hollowing when she was a girl. Numbness starting at the fingertips, patient as frost, and never once retreating once it arrived. It was not cold in the loft. Her father had kept the stove going since dawn. She let it go, because that was what you did with Tobin Calloway when he'd decided a conversation was finished. But she watched his hand for the rest of the afternoon, the way she watched a knot she didn't trust. By evening, the stiffness had crept past his second knuckle, and he'd taken to holding the ropework between his forearm and his chest, bracing it like a man compensating for an injury he refused to name. The rider came at dusk, on a horse lathered from hard riding, wearing a coat cut far too fine for salt work. He asked for the household of Tobin Calloway, in a voice pitched for formality rather than conversation, and pressed a sealed letter into Tobin's hands before riding back the way he'd come, refusing, when Wren asked, to say more than that his orders were only to deliver, not to explain. Wren watched her father's face change as he broke the seal. Watched something in him go still and gray, the way water goes still before it turns to ice. Duh. What does it say? He didn't answer at first. He set the letter down on the workbench as if it had grown too heavy to hold, and when he finally looked at her, She realized she had never once, in 24 years, seen her father look old until that exact moment. "There is a promise our family made," he said, "before you were born. One I should have told you about a long time ago." He told it slowly, the way a man tells a story he has rehearsed alone 100 times and never once said aloud. 25 years ago, the hollowing had come up the coast like a tide that never fully went back out, taking 11 souls from Gullhaven in a single winter. Wren's grandmother, Mered, had watched her own sister go numb and still within 6 weeks, and when word reached her that the Ansgar crown held an old covenant with the tidekeeper line of this coast, she had walked to Tideholm on her own feet and asked for it renewed. She had no wealth to offer, Tobin said. What she offered was truth, a vow that our line would answer when the tide came round again, and choose, freely, whether to renew the old trust between our two houses. The Ansgar king bound the sickness back on the strength of that promise. It slept 25 years because of what she swore. And I'm the one the tide comes round for now. You are. You never told me I was part of a bargain struck before I could speak for myself. I hoped, her father said, and his voice cracked on it, that if I never said it aloud, it might simply stop being true. Wren picked up the letter herself, then, and read the last lines with her own eyes, that the king's fleet was already at sea, that it would reach Gullhaven's harbor by first light, and that the long slack, the rare tidal window in which the old binding could be renewed, was coming early this year because the hollowing was stirring again along the northern reach of the coast. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the workbench with the letter long after her father and Cade had gone to bed, turning the words over the way she turned over a bad seam, looking for the place where it had all gone wrong, and found only her grandmother's name, and her own, joined by a promise she had never been asked to make. Dawn came gray and ordinary over the harbor, and 3 ships with sails the deep unmarked color of the royal fleet were already cutting through the morning mist toward Gullhaven's docks before the village had properly finished waking. Chapter 2. The crowd gathered before the gangplank had even touched the pier, the whole village turning out in its second-best coats to see a king most of them had never expected to lay eyes on. Wren watched from the loft roof, checking a seam in the drying canvas she didn't actually need to check, and told herself the height was the only reason her heart was beating too fast. She knew him before anyone said his name. He crossed the dock with the economical stride of a man who had never needed to hurry to be obeyed, tall in the way that rearranged a room's attention without asking for it, dressed plainly for a king, wool and leather rather than court finery. 2 steps behind him walked a lean, gray-haired man in a steward's chain, who scanned the crowd the way a merchant scans a ledger for errors. Wren noticed, too, how the guard at the base of the gangplank, a broad-shouldered man who moved with a wolf's coiled ease, straightened without being told the instant Soren's boots hit the dock, chin dropping half an inch, eyes deferring before a single word passed between them. Further back, 2 more guards in the royal color shifted their weight the same way, as if some current in the air had simply told them where the king now stood. It was not fear exactly. It was the particular stillness of something ancient recognizing its own tide. Soren's gaze crossed the drying racks and found her on the roof. It held a moment longer than courtesy required, then moved deliberately away, toward the harbor master waiting with the village elders, as though he had all the time in the world, and no need at all to spend it looking at a sailmaker's daughter. A woman found her in the loft that same afternoon, dark-haired, dressed for travel rather than court, with a directness Wren hadn't expected from anyone arriving with a royal party. "Isolde Vass," she said. "My uncle is steward of the Vantry coast. I came with the royal party, though not with his permission to speak to you. I wanted to see the household he's preparing to reorganize my whole future around, before he decides how the story of it gets told." She looked around the loft, the tools worn smooth with use, canvas stacked by weight and weave, and something in her face eased. "I'll tell him nothing at all, if he asks," Isolde went on. "I've learned it's safer not to hand my uncle useful sentences." She lowered her voice, though the loft was empty, but for the 2 of them. "The old wording your grandmother agreed to only asked for truth and presence at the tide, nothing more. But 2 Ansgar kings back, someone rewrote it, added a clause. If the Callaway heir refuses, or is found unwilling, the crown may take a substitute bloodline instead. My uncle's own grandfather helped draft that clause, and my uncle made certain, years ago, that the substitute named in it was mine. If you're declared unwilling, I'm married into the crown, and my uncle becomes the second most powerful man on this coast in everything but name. I want no part of it. I say this so you know where the wind's actually coming from." She left before Ren could ask how a promise had ever been rewritten into a threat, and the question sat in Ren's chest like a stone swallowed whole. That evening, in the loft's back room, the confrontation Ren had been avoiding for a full day finally came due. "You knew this could come to marriage," she said to her father, not loudly, but with an edge that made Cade, listening from the stairs, go quiet. "You knew there was a clause that could bind me to a man I've never met, and you called it a promise our family made, like it was a debt on a ledger and not my whole life." "I called my silence protection," Tobin said. "It wasn't. It was cowardice, Ren, and I've had 24 years to call it by its right name and never once did, because as long as I never said the words aloud, I could pretend the pact would simply pass us by. You had a right to know what might shape your future. I took that right from you. And there's no fixing it with an apology, only with the truth from here on. Then tell me the truth. If I refuse this, what happens to you?" Her father's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "The hollowing has already reached my wrist. If the pact isn't renewed, it will finish what it started, in me and in every soul on this coast still carrying the sickness in their blood. I won't pretend that isn't true. But I will not ask you to trade your freedom for my hand, Ren. Not now, not at the stones, not ever. If you refuse this crown, you refuse it with my blessing, whatever it costs me." "I understand you were afraid," Ren said, after a long silence, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't forgive you yet. I need you to understand that those are two different things, and I'm not ready to pretend they're the same just because it would be easier for both of us." "I don't expect you to be ready," Tobin said. "I'll wait as long as you need." He did not raise the subject again that night, and when Cade, 16 and furious on his sister's behalf in the particular reckless way of younger brothers, declared loudly that he'd sink the king's whole fleet himself before he'd let anyone marry Ren off like cargo, Tobin only put a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Then you'd better learn to swim faster than you have been," which was as close as he came, that night, to being himself again. Chapter 3. Soren came to the loft himself the following morning, without ceremony, without guards at his back beyond the one who waited outside the door with the particular patience of a man used to standing exactly where he was told. Tobin tried to rise, to bow, and Soren stopped him with a raised hand. "Sit, Master Calloway. Your hand troubles you. I've no wish to make that worse for the sake of my own comfort." He turned to Ren next, and up close his stillness resolved into something more specific. Not coldness, but control, the bearing of a man who had learned early that every unguarded motion he made would be read as command. "I want you to understand the shape of this before you fear it," he said. "The oldest wording asks only for truth and presence at the water, trust offered and returned. My grandfather added conditions that were never part of the original bargain. I intend to honor what your grandmother actually promised, not what convenience turned it into after. Your steward's niece already told me about the conditions he added," Ren said, watching his face carefully. "The marriage clause, the substitution clause." Something flickered across his expression, surprise, then a kind of grim acknowledgement. "Then you know more of my own family's law than I did a week ago. I've had my scholars searching the archive since the letter left Tideholm, and what they've found so far agrees with what you were told. I'd like to see the rest of it confirmed, if you'll allow me to look properly, rather than take my word or my steward's." It was, Ren decided, either the most honest thing anyone from Tideholm had said to her, or the most convincing performance of honesty she'd ever witnessed, and she did not yet trust herself to tell the difference. They spent that afternoon and the next in the loft's back room, where her grandmother's old sea chest had sat untouched since the funeral, going through what remained of Mairead Calloway's life a piece at a time. Soren proved surprisingly patient with tedious work, reading faded harbor records aloud, while Wren cross-referenced dates against the tide charts her family had kept for 3 generations, work that required more care than either of them expected, and left them, more than once, arguing companionably over whether a smudged numeral was a 3 or an 8. It was Wren who found it, in the end, not Soren's scholars. Folded into the lining of an old storm sail Mered had never let anyone else touch, stitched into the canvas itself in a pattern that looked, to an untrained eye, like nothing more than reinforcement work, was a second layer of writing, her grandmother's hand, worked in the same deep indigo thread Wren's mother had later inherited and hoarded, recording the exact words spoken at the original binding. I offer truth. I offer presence. I ask nothing given back, but what is freely returned. Let my line be called, and let them choose as I have chosen, with nothing owed beyond what trust allows. There was no mention of marriage, no mention of ownership, or claim, or blood beyond the blood already carried in a Calloway's veins. She never promised me to anyone, Wren said quietly, tracing the stitched words with one finger. She promised that we'd be asked. Soren read it twice before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had gone low in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. My grandfather rewrote a vow about trust into a claim of ownership, and every king after him inherited the claim without once going back to see what it had actually cost to make it sound like law. He looked up at her. I'd like to bring this before the assembly myself, when the time comes. It should be your grandmother's words the coast hears, not my grandfather's. That evening, with the discovery still sitting warm between them, he asked to see the ritual stones before the tide turned fully, to confirm, for the assembly's sake, that she carried the tidekeeper's mark her grandmother's own writing described. Tobin's hands would not manage the cliff path safely in failing light, so Wren went instead, telling herself it was only sense, not the pull of 2 days spent close beside him, that put her at his side on the wet sand. The mark had begun, faintly, to warm beneath her collar, the closer they came to the stones, an old resonance she had never felt before, and had no name for. Soren's expression sharpened as though he felt some echo of it too, his eyes going distant for a moment, the way a man's eyes go distant when he's listening to something no one else in the room can hear. He reached toward her collar to confirm what the warmth already told them both. Don't you dare touch me, Wren said, sharp enough that the guard behind them startled. His hand stopped in the air, close enough that she felt the heat of it, and for one unguarded second, something old and certain moved behind his eyes, the particular certainty of a man reciting a fact he had never once questioned. You were mine, he said, before birth. The silence afterward was the longest of Wren's life. I am not a stone to be confirmed, she said, when she trusted her voice again. I am not a debt with a face. My grandmother promised the coast would be asked. I did not agree to be claimed. Touch me without asking, your majesty, and you will learn exactly how little a Calloway cares for a crown. Soren lowered his hand entirely. Whatever she'd expected, offense, command, the cold retreat of a man unused to refusal, didn't come. Instead, his face did something she hadn't braced for. It recalculated, slow and startled, like a man walking into a familiar room and finding all the furniture rearranged. You're right to say that, he said finally. I've spent my whole life being told that letting go of a claim is weakness. 2 days in your grandmother's own words, and I still said it anyway. Because it wasn't memory that spoke. It was inheritance. My father's certainty. In my mouth. That doesn't make it harmless. No, he agreed. It doesn't. I never knew your name until the pact was called and word of you reached Tidehome, Wren. Whatever that sentence meant, it wasn't memory of you. It was a claim I'd never once questioned before you handed it back to me. I'm sorry. I don't expect one apology to prove anything. I'd rather show you, if you'll let me stay near enough to try. An apology isn't the same as understanding, Wren said, because it wasn't, and because she had learned young not to hand out forgiveness like it cost her nothing. I know, he said. I don't expect it to be. He walked her back up the cliff path in silence, matched carefully to her shorter stride, and left her at the loft door with a bow that felt, for the first time, less like ceremony and more like a debt still being paid. Chapter 4. Over the next 17 days, he returned often enough that the village stopped gathering at the windows each time the Alpha King crossed the harbor toward the Callaway loft. He came back the morning after the stones, and the one after that, not to oversee, but to work, badly at first. His hands, competent enough with a sword and a council table, made a ruin of a rope whipping that had Cade laughing until he had to sit down. "You're strangling it," Cade said. "It's rope, not an enemy." "Everything I've ever been taught to hold," Soren said, lightly enough to almost pass as a joke. "I was taught to hold like it might be taken from me." Ren heard the truth under the joke and said nothing, only filed it away. She taught him the harbor knot instead. The one her mother had taught her, the one every Callaway sailor learned before they were old enough to hold a proper blade. Tied correctly, it looked strong enough to hold a full-rigged ship against a storm, and it was, but pull the working end at the right angle, and the whole thing came loose in one motion. "Why build a knot that lets go so easily?" he asked. "Because the ones that don't eventually have to be cut," Ren said. "And cutting ruins a rope for anything else. A knot that can be undone on purpose is stronger than one that can only be broken." He looked at her a moment too long after that, like a man hearing a sentence land somewhere he hadn't expected, and said nothing more. But she noticed, in the days that followed, that he began tying that same knot into everything. His coat flap, his sword strap, small unnecessary places where a simpler knot would have done. She found the loft roof mended one stormy dawn, the old seam that had never quite held now patched with tar still warm, tied off in a harbor knot she recognized as her own teaching. She found Soren near the drying racks the next morning and said only, "You could have woken me." "You needed sleep more than I needed the credit," he said, and went back to what he'd been doing, as though kings did not ordinarily spend storm nights on fishermen's rooftops with tar under their nails. She learned from the Halloran brothers that a detachment of the king's own guard had turned up at dawn to help load their boat on schedule, on the king's order, because, the guard captain had apparently said, the crown did not care to be the reason a fair deal turned sour. In the second week, she watched him sit for 3 hours at the bedside of old Harlan's widow, whose hands had gone fully numb the winter before, listening to her describe the sickness stage by stage with a patience Ren hadn't expected from anyone born to a throne, and afterward she watched a young wolf guard, barely older than Cade, flinch back from his own frustration at not being able to help the old woman, until Soren simply set a hand on his shoulder, and the boy's whole posture steadied, as if the king's calm had reached into him and settled something that words alone couldn't have touched. It was the clearest thing Ren had seen yet of what an alpha's authority actually was. Not command shouted into a room, but a stillness other wolves borrowed when they had none of their own left. She said nothing about it to Soren. She simply began setting an extra cup at his elbow without being asked, and did not examine too closely what that meant. Corin Vass, meanwhile, had begun a quieter work of his own, visiting the assembly elders one at a time during those same 17 days, always with the same careful phrase, that the crown could not, in good conscience, force itself upon an unwilling house, and that Gullhaven owed it to itself to consider what mercy looked like if the Callaway girl had already, before witnesses, refused the king outright at the stones. He framed it to anyone who would listen, not as ambition, but as prudence, a coast too fragile to risk its king's line on an unwilling bond, safer served by stability than by sentiment. More than one elder nodded along, not because they distrusted Ren, but because Corin's argument wore the shape of caution, and caution was a coin that spent easily in a frightened village. Isolde, watching her uncle's quiet campaign from inside the royal party, came to the loft twice more in that stretch of days, each time a little more drawn, a little more careful about which door she used. Cade came home from the docks one gray afternoon near the end of the second week, salt in his hair and mischief in his eyes, muttering something about the alder boat needing an extra hand on the morning tide. And Ren, elbow deep in canvas, told him no in the same breath she always used, certain, the way she was always certain, that he would listen this time. He did not. And 2 nights later, at the tail end of the 3rd week, the wind off the water changed its voice. The storm rolled in faster than the coast watchers had predicted, and Wren woke already knowing, before anyone told her, exactly which boat was out there, and exactly who had lied about staying home. She was pulling on her father's old oilskins, with hands that would not stop shaking when Soren found her on the docks, fighting the wind to launch a rescue skiff alone. He didn't waste breath arguing she shouldn't go. He climbed in beside her and took the second oar. She knew this stretch of water better than any guard he could have brought, knew where the current pulled hardest, where the rocks lay just under the surface waiting to open a hull like a tin. And she called the course to him through the wind, correcting his stroke, steering them around a reef that would have ended the rescue before it began. He listened to every word she gave him, the way she'd noticed he listened to very little else on this coast, without needing to be convinced first. They found the alder boat listing hard, its mast broken, 3 men clinging to what was left of the rigging, and Cade nowhere in sight until Wren spotted him, a small dark shape half submerged, one arm hooked through a snapped spar, going under. Soren was over the side of the skiff before she finished shouting, shifting mid-dive into the gray wolf shape she had never yet seen, a powerful, streamlined weight cutting through black water with a strength no human arm could have matched. Wren held the skiff steady against the swell with everything she had, screaming her brother's name into the wind until her voice gave out, and watched the wolf's jaws close carefully around the back of Cade's collar, dragging him up and clear, powerful shoulders driving them both through the current toward her waiting hands. They made the harbor an hour before dawn, every soul from the alder boat accounted for. Wren sat in the bottom of the skiff with her brother shaking against her chest, and it wasn't until the danger had fully passed that she noticed the long, shallow gash along Soren's forearm, human again now, torn open on the broken spar. She brought him back to the loft rather than let him bleed on the dock in front of half the village, and sat him on the low stool by the stove while she cleaned the wound with hands that hadn't fully stopped trembling from the cold, or the fear, or both. "You could have sent your guard in," she said, not looking up from her work. "I could have," he agreed. "I didn't want to send anyone into that water I wasn't willing to go into myself." "Hearing you scream his name," he said after a moment, quieter, "frightened me worse than the storm did." He wasn't looking at her hands anymore. He was looking at her face, exhausted, and stripped of every careful edge she'd watched him wear since he stepped off that ship. "I've led men into worse water than that, and never once felt my own chest go this tight over it." She finished tying off the cloth, and didn't immediately let go of his arm. He lifted his other hand, slow, deliberate, and stopped a breath from a loose strand of hair the wind had pulled across her face. "May I?" he asked. She felt the whole night pressing on the question, the fear, the relief, the pact hanging over both of them like weather that hadn't broken yet, and could not, in that moment, tell where her own wanting ended and the weight of everything else began. "Not yet," she said. He lowered his hand without argument, without sulking, and something in his face, patient, unoffended, told her he had heard the "not" and the "yet both," and intended to respect the whole sentence. "Then I'll wait," he said, and the waiting itself felt, absurdly, more intimate than the almost kiss would have been. He left before the sun was fully up, and Wren stood a long time in the doorway after he'd gone, watching the space where he'd been, wanting, with an honesty that unsettled her, for him to have stayed a little longer. Isolde found her the following afternoon, her face drawn tight in a way that had nothing to do with weather. "My uncle has a guard willing to swear you struck the king at the stones and refused the pact outright," she said. "He means to bring it before the assembly before the long slack closes, so there's no time left to answer it properly. I have something that could stop him, but using it means I lose my place at court, and very likely my family's good opinion along with it. I mean to use it anyway. I only wanted you to know the cost isn't nothing, so you'd understand what it's worth when I say it." Chapter 5. Corin Vass stood before the gathered elders and guard captains 3 mornings later, with the calm of a man who believed he had already won. He laid out his account with careful, damning precision. That the Calloway girl had struck the king before witnesses, had refused the pact outright, and that under the old substitution clause his own grandfather had helped write into law, such a refusal freed the crown to bind itself instead to another bloodline. He called it prudence, not ambition. A coast could not afford to gamble its protection on an unwilling house, he said, when a willing one stood ready. He had a guard prepared to swear to a version of that night at the stones twisted just enough to be believed by people who wanted to believe it, and the man delivered his account with a steadiness that made more than one elder nod along. Isolde rose next and laid on the table before the assembly a folded letter bearing her uncle's own seal. A draft in his hand, dated months before Soren's fleet had ever left Tideholm, laying out the substitution clause and naming her explicitly as its beneficiary, written long before anyone at Gullhaven had spoken a single word to the king. My uncle did not write this because he feared an unwilling house, Isolde said, her voice steady though her hands were not. He wrote it because he needed a house that would be unwilling, and mine was the only one he could arrange to have ready. Corin's composure did not break at once. He accused his niece of being manipulated, of misunderstanding an old planning document, of confusing prudent contingency with conspiracy, and for a long moment, the hall seemed to hang between the two accounts, unable to decide which was truth. Soren turned to the guard who had sworn to the false version of the stones. "Tell the hall again," he said. "The hour you claim to have witnessed this." The guard repeated it. Soren asked him to describe the tide that night, the position of the torches, who had stood where. The man's account held for 2 questions, and faltered on the third. The details shifting in ways that didn't match the men who had actually stood on that beach. A torch he placed on the wrong side of the stones, a tide he described as coming in when it had in truth already begun its retreat. Soren did not raise his voice once. He simply asked the next question, and the next, with the patient, disciplined authority of a man used to being answered honestly, until the guard's composure finally cracked under the accumulated weight of his own contradictions, and he admitted, in a hall gone entirely silent, that Corin Vass had paid him to say what he'd said. Corin Vass was stripped of his stewardship before the session closed, his authority to speak for the coast revoked on the weight of his niece's evidence and his own guard's confession. He left Tideholm within the month and did not return. Soren rose once the hall had settled, and the room went silent the way rooms go silent for kings. "Everything true in the former steward's account is this," he said. "I reached for Wren Calloway at the stones without asking her leave, and she told me not to touch her. She was right. I obeyed. The words I said afterward were my father's beliefs, and his father's before him, but they came from my mouth because I had never done the work of questioning them. That failure is mine. Wren Calloway owes this crown neither marriage nor affection. She never did." He laid her grandmother's stitched words before the assembly, translated from the sail's lining, and watched the hall absorb what Mered Calloway had actually promised 25 years before. Truth, presence, and nothing owed beyond what trust allowed. "There is another way to hold the hollowing back," he said, turning to Wren. "I've had my own scholars and the Tidekeeper's writing both confirm it this past week. I can open my own alpha bond into the ritual stones in her place, surrender a permanent share of the strength that holds the Vantry pack together. My wolf will remain, but weaker. My hold on the pack bond will cost me effort every day for the rest of my reign that it has never cost me before. Rival clans along the northern reach may test a king who leads with a lesser strength, and I will have to hold this coast with judgment instead of instinct from that day forward. It will not cost anyone their life, and it will not leave the coast undefended. My captains and my line's other safeguards remain regardless, but it will cost me. I am prepared to pay it today, if that is what it takes for no one on this coast to ever again mistake protection for ownership." He did not wait for her answer. He turned toward the hall doors, already reaching to unclasp the sigil at his collar, the first step before walking to the ritual stones and opening his alpha bond there. It was only Wren stepping into his path, her hand closing over his wrist, that stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Let me choose first." He stopped instantly, his hand falling still beneath hers, and in his face she saw plainly that the offer had never been a bargain. He had truly meant to pay the price, whether she chose him afterward or not. He repealed, then and there, before the full assembly, both the forced marriage clause his grandfather had written and the substitution clause Corin had built his whole plan around, striking them from the old law in his own hand while the hall watched. The tide for the long slack would turn within hours. Wren stood in the quieting hall, aware for the first time in her entire life that the choice in front of her belonged to no one but herself. Chapter 6. She walked down to the ritual stones alone that evening, before the crowd, before Soren, while the last light went copper over water that would soon decide nothing except what she let it decide. She thought of her father's hand, numb past the wrist now, and of the way he had still refused to ask her to save it at the cost of herself. She thought of Soren's hand halfway to his own collar, already unclasping a strength he'd carried his whole life, before he knew whether she would choose him at all. She thought of her grandmother's stitched words, patient in the lining of an old sail for 25 years, waiting to be found. Soren found her there, and stopped a respectful distance off, hands loose at his sides, saying nothing, waiting to see which way she'd turn. "You already offered me a way out," Wren said. "I watched you mean it. So whatever I choose now, it isn't because 11 people died 25 years ago, and I'm afraid of being the reason for 11 more, and it isn't because I'm afraid of what happens to you if I refuse. I choose it or I don't. That's the whole of it." "That's the whole of it," Soren agreed. "I trust the man you're becoming," she said. "Not the pact, not the mark, you. And I want to see this coast kept safe with my own hand in it, the way my grandmother meant it to be kept. Chosen, not claimed. That's why I'm staying at these stones tonight." She took a length of rope from her coat pocket, one she'd tied herself that morning without quite admitting to herself why, and looped it loosely around both their wrists in a harbor knot, snug enough to hold, loose enough to release with a single deliberate pull. The tide came in around their ankles as she spoke the old words, and the stones themselves seemed to answer it, a faint warmth spreading up through the sand and stone alike. The crescent mark beneath her collar settling into something calm and steady, where it had once run hot and uncertain. Somewhere beneath the surface of him, she felt rather than saw the last resistance in Soren's bearing ease, as if whatever old, inherited certainty had spoken through him at their first meeting had finally, fully let go. "I bind what was offered to what is freely chosen," she said, her voice steady over the water. "Let the sickness sleep another generation, sealed not by claim, but by trust given and returned." Soren's voice joined hers on the last words, low and certain, and where their joined wrists touched the incoming tide, the old stones seemed to exhale. A settling, a release, the particular stillness of a debt finally closed rather than collected. On the cliff above, though neither of them could see it yet, Tobin Calloway felt the first faint prickle of returning feeling reach his numbed fingers, sharp as pins after long cold, the beginning of something that would take weeks, not moments, to finish healing. Neither of them called what happened at the stones anything more than what it was. When the rope came undone a moment later at Wren's own tug, Soren only nodded, as if he'd expected nothing else, and wanted nothing else. And that, more than any vow, was what convinced her he had actually changed. The months that followed held no promises neither of them had earned yet. Soren split his season between Tideholm and Gullhaven, arriving with royal commissions for Calloway sales rather than gifts meant to purchase affection. And Wren watched him continue the harder, less visible work of reform, long after there was any magical or romantic guarantee waiting for him at the end of it, rewriting the old substitution law properly, appointing new stewards to the Coastal Council, sitting through tedious archive sessions to make certain no future king could ever again mistake his grandfather's convenience for his ancestors' covenant. She visited Tideholm twice that autumn, on her own horse, on her own terms, and disagreed with him once, sharply, in front of his own council, over a harbor tariff she thought would ruin 3 fishing families to save the crown a season's shortfall. He heard her out fully, changed the policy, and told the council afterward without embarrassment that the sailmaker from Gullhaven understood coastal trade better than half the men in that room. Her letters to him, and his to her, grew longer than either of them probably intended, full of small, true things. Tobin's fingers finally curling fully around a rigging awl again in early winter, Cade's apprenticeship papers with the royal shipwrights arriving the same week he turned 17. Isolde settling into a new role advising the Coastal Council on Maritime Law, a position she'd built herself rather than been handed, and building it well enough that even the elders who'd once distrusted her name now sought her counsel first. It was Wren, in the end, who asked the question, on an ordinary evening in the loft the following spring, with the last of her mother's indigo thread wound around her fingers for a sail she was finally proud enough to spend it on. "You've never once asked me the other question," she said, not looking up from her needle. "The one that isn't about tides or thrones." Soren, sitting across from her working a harbor knot into a coil of rope with hands that had gotten, over a year, genuinely good at the craft, went still. "I didn't want you to feel claimed twice," he said. "Once was already too many times." "Ask anyway." He set the rope down and came to kneel beside her stool, close enough that she could feel the old warmth of him, and this time when he reached toward her face, he stopped well short of touching, his hand open in the space between them. "May I?" he asked. Wren closed the distance herself, pressing his palm to her cheek with her own hand over his, and felt no old certainty in it at all. Only a question she was finally answering on her own terms. "Marry me," Soren said. "Not because a pact was owed, and not because a tide demanded it. Because I would choose you every morning for the rest of my life, and I'd like the chance to prove that, out loud, for as long as you'll let me." "Yes," Wren said, and meant it the whole way through. He didn't move to seal it at once. Instead, he drew back a little, enough to look at her properly, and something careful crossed his face. The same discipline she'd watched him practice at the Stones a year before, still holding, still asking. "May I ask for the bond as well?" he said. "Not the one our families wrote before us, but one we choose now, freely, with nothing owed on either side." "Ask it properly, then," Wren said, though her voice had gone unsteady with something that wasn't fear. "Will you let me mark you as mine, Wren Calloway? Only because you choose to be. And only for as long as choosing it still feels like the truth to both of us?" "Yes," she said again. And this time she was the one who guided his hand to the crescent beneath her collar, pressing his palm flat over the mark that had once warmed with an inheritance neither of them had asked for, and now warmed, gently, with something they had built themselves. The bond that rose beneath his touch was nothing like the confusion of that first night at the Stones. No ancient certainty speaking through him, no claim older than either of their lives. It was warm and mutual, and entirely present, and when it settled, she felt him as clearly as he must have felt her. Not owned, not claimed, simply chosen, the same way the harbor knot at both their wrists had always been strong enough to hold and free enough to release, should either of them ever need it to. She kept the Calloway name. She kept the loft, the harbor, the craft her mother had taught her, and the authority she'd earned in every council room she'd ever sat in, and the reformed pact, written now in words closer to her grandmother's than her king's, would never again ask a Calloway daughter to be anything but asked. On quiet mornings, long after the wedding, Soren still sat across from her at the workbench, tying that same harbor knot into whatever rope was nearest, strong enough to hold, simple enough to let go, if either of them ever needed it to, though neither of them ever did. Thank you for staying with Wren and Soren all the way to the end of the tide. If you'd like more stories like this one, the subscribe button is right there whenever you're ready for the next.